Hi, good evening. Welcome to tonight's program, An Evening with Nicholas Kristof. I'm Nicole Folk, coordinator of Inforum, the Commonwealth Club's Innovation Lab. So the video you just saw, it gives you a good idea of what we try to do at Inforum. I think Inforum represents everything that's cultured and curious about the Bay Area. Not only the chance to meet with world leaders, but also to meet and connect with the most fabulous and interesting people in the Bay Area, like you and me. So we couldn't host such fabulous speakers like Nicholas Kristof and Jessica Jackley without the support of our members and sponsors. So if you'd like to support us in any way, become a member, become a sponsor, please talk to our guest services team in the lobby on the way out, and they'd be happy to talk to you. And on that note, I'd like to thank Bravium Winery for being our wine sponsor this evening. Thank you. In the latter part of the program, Nick is going to be answering your questions live. So there's going to be a mic in this aisle here, and Jessica is going to moderate the questions. So if you have a question, line up, and Jessica will give you a cue. Before I bring our moderator to the stage, I just want to tell you about some of our upcoming programs. Tomorrow night, we're in the financial district at our headquarters hosting Nick Carr. He penned the controversial article, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And from there, we have a really killer fall lineup, so I encourage you to check it out. We're hosting Reid Hoffman. We're back here at the Castro Theater hosting Marissa Mayer in conversation with Mark Benioff, Chef Mario Batali in conversation with Chef Tyler Florence, Andy Cohen, a panel featuring women on the ground in Haiti, Jared Diamond, and so much more. So please check us out. So lastly, one of the many perks of my job is that I get to read galley copies of books way before they're released. So I was reading A Path Appears on BART this summer. This is my copy. It's very loved and coffee stained. So I hope our conversation this evening and this book touches all of you in the same way. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our moderator for the evening and co-founder of Kiva, Jessica Jackley.
Thank you. Slowly. Okay. Thank you so much. And Heels and I are not close friends. I'm going to sit while I talk to you. Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you so much to all of you for coming tonight. I'm thrilled to be here to interview a personal hero of mine, Nicholas Kristof. He's done so much, and I look up to him for so many reasons. One particular story that always stands out to me, back in 2007, Nick wrote an article in the New York Times on a small loan that he made on Kiva to a bank, I think it was a baker in Afghanistan. I wrote down banker, but it's baker. And he later went on to meet that baker and tasted the 12-cent loaves of bread that he had helped fund. He gave so much humanity to Kiva and attention to it in the very early stages, and I'll be forever personally grateful for that. But I know that probably everybody in this room is here because there's been some insight that you've gained from his writing and his reporting, some argument he's made that's changed how you think or feel about service and purpose and possibility in the world. And I bet that for everybody here, you have a personal story too, of something that's touched you or changed you. So we are all in your debt. I'm sure we're all grateful and excited for time with you tonight. Nick is here tonight specifically for his latest book, A Path Appears, also quite beloved already for me, and it will also air as a PBS documentary in January, so keep an eye out for that. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof. Thank you. Thank you. How are you tonight?
Thank you, and boy, what a setting. Pretty amazing.
Quite bright up here also, so I think there are people out there. I think I saw them before we arrived up here on stage.
And if the conversation runs out, we can just look up and kind of admire, you know?
Yes. Well, let's get right to it. I wanted to start with this. You acknowledge in your book that a lot of people you've seen feel paralyzed in the face of huge social problems. Why don't you?
You know, I think because I have, in the course of my time reporting, I've seen real progress. when I first began traveling around Africa in 1982, the thing that really struck me was the blindness. There were so many middle-aged people who were unnecessarily blind, of river blindness or trachoma or cataracts, and these days that is much less true. Jimmy Carter made tremendous progress against river blindness, and cataracts can be resolved for surgery, often costing less than $100. Trachoma may be just about the most painful way to go blind. One woman we quote in the book describes it as like the pain of childbirth day in, day out, year in, year out. And she...
Too close to home.
Yes.
Sorry.
Remind me to be careful of my metaphors.
Watch it.
Because she was blind, she was unable to farm her land, and some of her children had died as a result. So it was much more than blindness. And then she got a $40 surgery through Helen Keller International. $40 by this nurse. Took 20 minutes, and it, completely transformed her life and her family's. And to see that happen, that reminds you of our capacity to make a difference, not to resolve the problem of blindness globally. I think we sometimes think that to make a difference, we have to solve a problem. We're not going to solve a problem, but we can quite easily take steps that are transformative for other people. And that is incredibly empowering, not only of those other people, but of ourselves too.
Great answer. One of the things that I appreciated so much about this book was that you tell obviously some amazing stories about individuals who've had these transformational changes, who have often lifted themselves up with just a little bit of help, a little bit of intervention from a great organization or an individual's generosity. And you tell stories of organizations that are not the usual suspects. Not all of them are the usual suspects in the social sector. You talk about organizations that have been overlooked because they're small or just not sexy enough, or often because they're brand new and you admit freely, hey, we don't know if this is going to succeed, this might not make it. I love that you did that. And I think with a lot of nonprofits, you also mentioned that while shareholders reward corporations for taking risk, in the nonprofit sector it's very different, and they're held to a different standard. Can you talk a little bit about what you think nonprofits in particular, a nonprofit's role is in taking risks and pushing things forward and innovating? Seems like there's a unique opportunity there that I might be reading into, but that you're trying to highlight.
I think there's sort of a broader problem we face, which is that it's kind of silly, frankly, that a lot of families will take one pool of money and they will invest that in the stock market, and for that they don't care about social return, but they want a maximum possible financial return. And then they take another pool of money, just sort of the charitable money, and they entirely give that away, and they want zero return. They don't want to preserve their capital at all. And it's this incredible bifurcation, while in fact the world is more complicated. You can't, the old way of thinking was to divide the world into corporations, evil, and nonprofits, noble. And obviously it's much more complicated than that. There are plenty of nonprofits that don't actually achieve very much, and there are some corporations that have quite a good impact. And I think that if we can figure out ways of not having this stark bifurcation, but acknowledge that maybe we want to invest some money and get a smaller return, but also have a positive social impact in a way that is more sustainable, or maybe get our capital back, but not the interest, or the move toward companies that are double bottom line or triple bottom line. I think that we're kind of on the cusp of a new ways of having an impact that is much more sophisticated than the old division, and that will, I hope, infuse the nonprofit sector with a lot of new ideas and new ways of doing things.
What do you think would have to happen to free nonprofits to do that more? Is it just much more enlightened donors that have, that explicitly give permission to organizations to take risks and to fail? I also really appreciated that you mentioned some failures in the sector, although they were great social experiments, and we've all learned a lot from them.
I mean, one of the basic problems is that we demand all kinds of unreasonable things from nonprofits, and those constrain them. And people, I mean, donors have been kind of trained to look at Charity Navigator or other sites and really look very, very closely at some of these financial ratios. And in one sense, that's useful. I mean, you don't want to donate to a charity that is, spending its money building the most glorious marble lobby for itself. But on the other hand, really what you want is impact. And those financial ratios don't determine impact. And so, and one of the problems with that stress ratios is that often nonprofits underinvest in their people, underinvest in IT, underinvest in training, and sometimes don't pay people enough to retain and to hire and retain the best people. And so I think that there needs to be something of a revolution on the part of us donors, and to accept more risk, to focus more on impact and acknowledge that ratios, that if money is spent in administration, that's not a waste. That can indeed help advance the cause.
Yep. You also say that a lot of nonprofits underinvest in marketing, for example. You bring up that thought, that idea, right? And there were three things, maybe I'm linking them incorrectly here, but three things that I think are so fascinating and memorable. You talked about how thinking logically can impair giving. There's research that shows that if the rational side of our brain is activated, the moral feelings that we might have that could lead us to donate on the spot might be held back or impaired or muted. You talk about that. You had a crazy statistic or an anecdote in there about how men are more generous to a charity when they're asked by an attractive woman, and in fact, the more attractive they perceive the woman to be, the more they'll give. I'm just leaving that out there for people. And then you did talk about Brian Mullaney, and Dan Pallotta, Brian Mullaney of Smile Train, and Dan Pallotta, whose TED Talk about charity being dead wrong. It went viral at least a number of months ago, if not earlier. And there was an example you brought up about how some people might argue that using pictures, I'm kind of quoting here, of a white boy to raise money that goes overwhelmingly to kids in Africa is misleading, but as long as the charity is sticking to its mission and showing results, then selling a cause is also important. Can you talk a little bit about this tension between wanting donors to be more educated and more active and more rational and thoughtful about their giving, but also knowing that sometimes, the people designing marketing campaigns know these tricks, know these things about what gets people to give, and it might not always be, use your brain more. That was a long question.
This is broadly speaking, this is an issue that I became interested in when I was writing about Darfur, and it felt as if I was going there and these columns about Darfur were just kind of sinking without a ripple. And at the same time, it was incredibly frustrating because those of you who traveled to New York, you may remember that at that same time in 2004, there were these two red-tailed hawks living in Central Park, a pale male and his wife, I forget what her name was, and they had been kicked out of their nest in an apartment building right next to Central Park. And New York was all up in arms and so indignant about these two homeless red-tailed hawks. And I thought, how is it that I can't generate as much outrage about hundreds of thousands of people being killed as New Yorkers feel about two homeless red-tailed hawks? And so that led me to the work of some social psychologists who look at this question of what generates empathy, what engages us with a cause. And that's what led me to this question of rationality. And it turns out that, that basically we in journalism and we in the humanitarian world, if you will, do everything exactly wrong. One thing is we talk about the scale of the challenge. There are X million people suffering from this, and in fact, the larger the number we talk about, the less inclined people are to give. And in fact, the number at which engagement diminishes is when N goes from 1 to 2, the moment you have more than one. It's about individual stories. It's about an individual picture. It's about emotional pathways. And as Jessica said, if you ask people to do math problems first so that the more rational side of their brain is activated, then they donate less. Really pretty sobering. And so part of it is this storytelling, this sort of emotional pathway to open up channels of empathy. And the other is that there has to be some arc of hope and possibility. And so if you just present all the problems all the time, then people just become overwhelmed and think it's hopeless and they don't see that they're going to have an impact. So you have to present the problem, but also show that there can be a better outcome if people engage. And in that, if you do those things, open up with an individual story and some possibility of hope, then I think one can. And I think that, often people who care deeply about these issues don't adopt those tools and do the opposite, talk about large numbers of people and make it all sound pretty despairing. And on the question of marketing, I think a lot of humanitarians flinch at the idea of marketing. That's what Coca-Cola does. It is so much more important to market bed nets or clean water or vaccines, which are potentially life-saving, than it is, I don't care whether Coke managed to market well. I really care whether clean water gets marketed in a way that lives can be saved.
Yeah. The identifiable victim effect that you just talked about. So I think we all kind of know this at a gut level, that stories move us, and stories of an individual person, not two, but one person, are especially resonant. And the Stalin said it maybe quote of a single death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. So profiling individuals versus having a poster child works, right? And real individuals, not just an example story. This is becoming the norm now, and it's really exciting to see. Do you worry about a saturation effect? And if and when that happens, do these stories ever add up to be sort of a group, to be a statistic, and we get numb? We start to expect that we know the story, and they don't become as special. What is the cure for that?
I don't think I worry so much about that as such. I do worry that we invariably tend to over-donate to anything that you can put a face on or a name on. Mm-hmm. I do think that, universities the universities have figured out how to sell the same thing about 10 times over. So you have the Bill Smith wing or the Bill Smith room and the Joe Jones wing of the such and such building, and the such and such professor walks in it. And I think that's very clever. I think that nonprofits are figuring out better how to do something similar with kind of naming opportunities. But there are so many incredibly important interventions that don't slice and dice very well. So anything that you can put a name on gets overinvested, and anything you can't really slice and dice gets underinvested in. And there's clearly kind of a market failure there. But I guess I don't worry about that this will just numb people, because one of the fascinating things that Cheryl and I learned in working on the book is that the richest 20% of people in America actually donate less to charity than the poorest 20%. And that seems to be not because affluent people are intrinsically not empathetic or helpful, but it's just that if you were affluent, you manage to insulate yourself from need. You live in some nice neighborhood where your neighbors aren't particularly needy, you don't encounter it, and so you don't respond. Well, if you were poor in America, every day you see people who are poorer than you and needier than you, and so you respond and you give. I do think that some of these kinds of connections become a way to remind the affluent of needs out there, mm-hmm. and to connect them to those needs, and are a way of kind of a circuit breaker to break through that insulation that we construct around ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm not really worried about saturation too, but I've heard that argument, and thought you might have a good take on it. You mentioned Cheryl. It's a bummer she can't be here tonight as your co-author and your very significant other. What would she say it's like to work with you?
I wonder if she's watching this now.
I know.
Oh, my cell phone's ringing. It's Cheryl.
That would be great. Speakerphone.
First of all, Cheryl sends her regrets about not being here. Our baby, our youngest, is a high school senior, and if we traveled together on this book tour, our daughter would have the most amazing parties at her house. So it seemed more prudent to divide.
Risk mitigation.
There is this slight burden in the family when you have this reputation of being a sensitive man, and the guy who was thinking that whenever the garbage needs taken out, it's sort of who does it fall to? Well, where's that sensitive man? What happened to him? And
this guy taking garbage out.
But I must say we've had this sort of amazing partnership, and people always ask how we manage to write books together and stay married. And the truth is that if you can raise 3 kids together and stay married, a book is a piece of cake,
I'd agree.
You can put a book to bed at night and it stays asleep. A book doesn't play you off each other. And if you totally screw up on a book, the stakes are lower. So,
great answer.
So it's been really a wonderful partnership.
I love it. You mentioned your 17-year-old, 18-year-old?
Just turned 17.
In the book, you talked about how it's really exciting to see a lot of young people see a path in social entrepreneurship as a possible career, but that perhaps one of the challenges of the state of social entrepreneurship right now is that a lot of young people equate success with being a founder. And you said, we need more entrepreneurs. We need more people who can go into an existing organization or government and say, I'm going to change it from the inside out. How do you make this happen? Is it something that corporations should take on and create new roles to sort of honor the entrepreneurs? Do we need a public campaign against the cult of the founder? What do you think is the trick there?
I think that sort of social norms have to change, and there is a bit of a problem right now that everybody wants to found something, and so we have this incredible multiplicity of tiny organizations that don't scale up. And then after a few years, often the founder will lose interest, move on. In the corporate sector, that's solved with M&A, but in the nonprofit sector, we don't really have M&A. So I think...
Should we?
I think we should. There should be, I really think it'd be wonderful if there were more M&A in the nonprofit sector, and some of these organizations that have kind of foundered a little bit, that if they merged with others and their mailing lists and donor lists were absorbed, I think that would be fabulous.
Well, and what about, you even noted that, I guess I didn't fully appreciate this, 99.5% of applications to the IRS for organizations to become a public charity are approved. Should there be a gating factor? Should there be some other way of not wasting time and money at the onset, and maybe a higher bar for people to have that opportunity to start something?
I also see some great little niche organizations started by people that really do serve missions by others, and I'm a believer in social entrepreneurs, so I guess I wouldn't want to create a higher bar, but maybe that's also a function of education of us donors. And I think one of the basic problems is that we tend to give to those who are good at asking. Mm-hmm. And so, and the ones who are good at asking often aren't those who are good at spending. Mm-hmm. And so, we get a phone call, a market from some organization that has a name, that children with cancer in it, or veterans with disabilities, or whatever it may be. And we just intuitively kind of feel embarrassed if we don't give. We don't know anything about the organization, but we tend to give. We reward organizations that are aggressive about calling, and I think that that leads to precisely those organizations, and it's often, I think, a waste of resources. And considering that there are organizations that do brilliantly with that money and could use so much more, it's a shame that we aren't better at, that we aren't more careful in how we give. We would never, if somebody called us up and said, hey, you want to buy a television? We would never say, oh, okay, sure, yeah, I'm here. In the same way, I think we should just be more careful when we invest in a cause that is potentially life-saving.
That makes total sense. So back to the donors, back to the responsibility
Educating
of
donors, responsible
the funders
donors.
of these groups. Yeah. You have so many stories. You've seen so much. Can you talk about some of the most exciting, again, perhaps overlooked, disruptive innovations that you've seen in the social sector, whether at an organization level or a technology level?
One cool innovation that I liked, it has to do with a great Father's Day present that I got.
The little rat?
They're hero rats, yeah. Yeah.
There's a great story, please.
So there are these giant Gambian pouched rats that live quite long and have a brilliant sense of smell. And so they've been trained to sniff out landmines. And they're used in both Angola and Mozambique. And they walk across minefields and they don't set them off because they're too light, and they sniff a mine, and then people can clear it. And so in 2 hours, one of these hero rats can clear more land than a human deminer can in 2 days. And so a organization called Apopo lets you sponsor the education of a rat for, I think, about $50 or so. And so my kids, 1 year for Father's Day, got me a hero rat in my name. And what a macho present, big rat. So much better than a necktie. I thought that was both something innovative in the field and also clever marketing that really can make a global difference.
Why do you think your kids care so much? Do you have any quick pieces of parenting advice for people who think, wow, I want my kids to get me a rat?
Well, I think probably like a lot of people, we want our kids to be empathetic, to understand how lucky they are. So we drag them around on our trips. I remember my daughter once, when she was about 13, I took her out of school, was dragging her through some slums in Honduras and then through these villages in Nicaragua. And at one point she turned to me and said, Dad, my friends, when they go on vacation, they go to the Caribbean. And so we kind of Cheryl and I realized that she had a point, and so for our next vacation, we did make a family trip to the Caribbean. We went to Haiti during the cholera outbreak. And does it work? I really do think that there is something to be gained in when you see. I don't think talking to kids about, oh, you're incredibly lucky, I don't think that really goes very far. I do think that visualizing needs of other people, whether it's domestic or foreign, does for a little while make kids feel kind of that maybe they are a little lucky. I think it does create a little bit of perspective. And beyond that, I think it's just a matter of modeling behavior, and maybe they will, one hopes, adopt those norms by the time they turn 50 or 60.
Sounds like they are way ahead of the curve. Can you talk a little bit about the role of media, social media, traditional media, to bring attention to these important issues that you have brought so much to?
This is actually something that kind of scares me a little bit and troubles me as a journalist. I think that we in the mainstream news media are increasingly maybe dropping the ball on all kinds of important issues. Global health, nutrition, global poverty, and domestic poverty. And that's because traditionally, I don't think we ever did a great job covering these issues, but there was at least some sense of responsibility that these are issues we should cover. These days, the business model for traditional news media has collapsed. Television especially is desperate for viewers, and viewers are not so interested in these kinds of stories. And so it's, if you're an executive producer of a program, you can send somebody off on some global story, and it's incredibly expensive, and then your ratings will drop compared to your rival, who just put a Democrat and a Republican in a little studio together and have them yell at each other. And I find that very depressing. The Gates Foundation had to try to deal with this, business model collapse, essentially bribed ABC News a couple of years ago to cover global health and nutrition issues. And it was called a grant, but, this was controversial in the development community, because here the Gates Foundation is taking money that could be used for delivery of services to some of the world's needy, and instead it's giving it to overpaid television executives to do what they should be doing anyway. So it was controversial. And though in that year, ABC News really did some good stories. They did stories about maternal health, maternal mortality. They did stories about vitamin A deficiency, about nutrition. And it elevated those issues in the national agenda, which is certainly one step to dealing with them. And then at the end of the year, Gates Foundation decided, okay, this is working. Let's renew it. Let's pay another annual bribe. And ABC News said, no, we don't want to do this again, because they can see from their audience metrics that those are the moments when viewers are turning the channel, going to the bathroom, whatever. And I found that so dispiriting. And if we can't figure out how to cover some of these issues in a way that audiences will relate to and tune to, then these issues are going to drop off the map. And these will have real consequences for addressing them. The whole international community dropped the ball on Ebola. Here you have an infectious disease that started at the end of 2013, and it was really only in around August that people began to take it seriously. Well, if journalists had been covering this aggressively right from the beginning, if this had been on TV in nightly newscasts all along, I think that there would have been pressure to address it earlier. That would have saved money and saved lives. But that, I think, is just not going to happen in this new paradigm for television coverage in particular. And so that means we have to find other ways to fill that vacuum. And there are a lot of smart people in San Francisco who know social media, who understand new platforms. I'm hoping that to some degree, social media can fill that vacuum and can make some stories go viral or call attention to these issues. To some extent that happened with the missing Nigerian schoolgirls, that garnered international attention in part through Twitter. But we've got to figure out a way to fill the gaps that increasingly are going to be filled by those of us in the mainstream media dropping the ball. Not to cheer you up, but...
Yeah. Jump in a little bit here. I actually heard an interview earlier today on NPR where you were asked, are you a man of faith? And you started to discuss the God gulf you bring up in the book, and meaning the difficulties that exist, the chasm that exists between people of faith, people who do not ascribe to a particular religious institution or faith experience. And I find this a really interesting and really resonant, important issue. I'm married to a very loud, outspoken, and quite dashing Muslim man. He's right there. And I was raised Christian. Our life together, our family, is sort of this ongoing exercise and expression of interfaith action. And besides marrying the person and falling in love and marrying them, which is totally effective but not scalable, what have you seen? What works best to bring people of different, just sets of values even, but certainly different faiths together to do good in the world?
One of my big frustrations is that there are so many issues where actually the secular community and the faith community are both doing good work on it, but because of the polarization in the U.S. and the incredible, and this God gulf, they don't cooperate and so accomplish much less than they would otherwise. And sex trafficking is, a great example of that. It's an incredibly important issue. Secular feminists are doing very good work on it. Evangelical Christians are doing good work. There are areas where they disagree, but there's huge commonality. I mean, everybody agrees that 16-year-old girls shouldn't be out on the street, and the police shouldn't be arresting them. They should be arresting the pimps. And yet, it's so hard to generate that cooperation and to put the pressure on prosecutors, on police, on city officials. I think, again, that just has to come ultimately from from both constituencies to kind of hold their nose and reach out and build practical partnerships to get things they care about done. If one doesn't do that, then the losers are those, the voiceless out there on these issues who just aren't getting attention. The other thing that struck us, Cheryl and me, when we were working on the book is that the secular world traditionally has kind of made giving sort of this solitary activity and often perceived as sort of a sacrifice, while especially the megachurches make it this joyous social activity. And I really think I think that's a pretty clever approach that the secular world should adopt. And indeed, we write about some organizations like Dining for Women or Bead for Life, sort of groups of, often it's women, but it wouldn't have to be, who get together and...
Isn't there a beer one that you said men?
Beer for books?
Beer for books,
yeah, that's the male equivalent. But, things that embody a certain amount of fellowship in some sense, in a very secular way, with some sense of giving back, of some larger cause. And to me, that feels a little bit like a secular version of what the megachurches are doing in creating a social giving community. And I wonder if that isn't going to...
I love that. I think that's a huge piece that is hard to quantify, but the social component is really important. Yes. Oh. I'll let you read your secret note. You mention a few surprising links in the book that are intriguing and sort of delightful to hear about, like how perhaps the intended effect of deworming kids was one thing, but there's a link to literacy later in life. Are there any other links that you can highlight for us that are surprising and unexpected and maybe seem to be several steps removed? Or, maybe better, do you have any hypotheses about links that exist out there, unexpected links between one intervention and an effect later on that maybe haven't been proven out yet, but you kind of have a hunch will be proven at some point?
One thing that I found fascinating that sort of goes to that has to do with something that is hard to talk about, which is self-destructive behaviors. And this is something that in my reporting I've seen just all the time, that families don't have enough money for a bed net to protect against, but the dad is going off 3 times a week to buy banana beer, and
not with the group that then gives the money to. Right? Sorry, maybe too much. Sorry.
Globally, as just a ballpark figure, it seems that families earning less than $2 a day globally are spending about 10 times as much on a combination of alcohol, tobacco, sugary drinks, prostitution, and very extravagant festivals as they are on education, which is for their kids, which is a great investment. And so, how do you address the sort of self-destructive behaviors, whether it's abroad or at home? And I think that we now have pretty good evidence that some of these come from a sense of hopelessness and despair that sometimes is actually clinical depression, and that in any case becomes self-fulfilling, that people feel that they just can't escape this. They self-medicate, and then that despair becomes self-fulfilling, and often for the next generation, self-replicating. So how does one break that cycle? I think that there's a scholar at MIT, Esther Duflo, did some fascinating work on an organization that gave gifts of cows. It was an offshoot of a program by BRAC, the Bangladeshi organization. And it surprised her that this gift of a cow turned out to have a much greater impact on reducing poverty than made sense. It had that not only did the family earn more money on livestock income, which would make sense, but also on their family plot, family garden plot, on odd jobs they earned. And it turned out essentially that these families had kind of just given up. And then once they got this gift of a cow, they suddenly foresaw that maybe they could live a better life, and maybe their children could go on to high school and could do more. And so then they began working many more hours in their private plot. They spent less money on temptation goods. They worked more on odd jobs. And I wonder if one of the reasons why a lot of interventions end up working, domestically or abroad, is not because of the nature of that intervention itself, but because the recipient suddenly has this new sense of possibility, and that in turn is in part what is transformative by empowering that individual.
You talk about the importance of mentorship. Early on in your own life and career, did you have mentors that helped inspire you to take your career to this incredible level and to pursue what you loved?
I mean, I got to say, my parents were incredible mentors and pushers, and some wonderful journalists who pointed me in this way. But really, what I think for both Cheryl and me, what really moved us in this direction was the people we interviewed. And then when it becomes, when you see these stories and these people, I started out as an economics reporter, writing about international economics and debt and exchange rates, and I wrote I thought I was going to write one story about kids being prostituted back in 1996 in Cambodia, and I saw these little girls who had been kidnapped and were being sold, and realized that this was just like 19th century slavery, except they were going to be dead of AIDS by the early 20s. And it's really hard to spend a day with them and write a story and then go back to writing about exchange rates. Mm-hmm. And likewise Darfur, I thought I'd write one piece, and then you talk to these incredible people struggling along, and they haunt you. So in that sense, my mentors are some amazing people that I've had the privilege of spotlighting in my column.
I love it. We only have a few minutes before we go to audience Q&A, so start thinking about what you would like to ask. And I thought it'd be fun to do a little bit of a lightning round. No pressure. I mean, you can answer with more than one word, but I'm going to ask you a few quick ones, okay?
Okay.
Which comes first, happiness or altruism?
Maybe happiness.
Okay, maybe elaborate a little bit if you don't mind. I know, I'm so sorry, but it's in the book. It's in the book. I'm not just making it up.
Well, one of the things that is kind of fascinating is that we often start off with altruism by trying to help other people, and there's abundant evidence we end up helping ourselves. And my favorite correlation was that not only does it make us happier, it makes us healthier. And one study looked at mortality rates for seniors, and it found that if you joined a church, your mortality risk dropped 29%. If you exercise several times a week, your mortality risk drops 30%. If you volunteer several times a week, it drops 44%. And then, the obvious conclusion is that if you just volunteer for a religious running organization, you live forever.
Perfect.
But the research is overwhelming about the benefits to oneself, emotionally and physiologically, from pro-social behavior.
Wonderful. If you could give everyone one book, everyone in the world in their own language, one book, and it can't be ones that you've written, what would it be?
There was a brilliant book written a few years ago by Lawrence Cass and Claudia Golden at Harvard called The Race Between Education and Technology, which argued that the reason that the US had risen to global economic preeminence was essentially that we focused on mass education. Beginning in the 19th century, we were the first country to have close to universal literacy, then the first country to send many, many people to high school, then the first to make tertiary education very widespread. And that laid the groundwork for our economic development. That Europe was better in elite education, we were better in mass education. And they argue it very compellingly. And unfortunately, though, since about 1970, so many other countries have eclipsed us in mass education, in high school graduation rates and tertiary education rates, and especially in the working class in America. There's no longer a sense that a kid is going to get a better education than their parents. And I think that is something that compromises not only the future of those kids, but of our country as a whole.
I don't like generalizations, but here goes anyway. You've met a lot of people in a lot of different places. What sets Americans apart, if anything, for better or for worse, from other people and other cultures that you've encountered?
We understand that everybody can understand English if it's spoken loudly enough.
It's a secret.
That partly compensates for our linguistic challenges.
Great answer. Okay, next. Do you want to keep going? No pressure.
No, that's fine.
Okay. Favorite cause that has nothing to do with or very little to do with the needy in the way you've described need in your book.
I'm sorry, favorite cause?
Favorite cause that maybe is a little bit off center of serving the needy.
I'd say wilderness. I'm a very enthusiastic backpacker. I think that it's incredibly important that we not only preserve wilderness, but figure out ways of into it to see the therapy of being in the cathedral of the wilderness.
Wonderful. And I'm going to interject before I ask the last one. Because we're going to questions in a minute here, there are mics. Are they in the aisles? I can't see anything anymore. Okay, great. You can start lining up, and we ask everyone in advance to keep these to one single part, not two part, three-part questions, and respectful, concise questions for our guests. Okay? I actually don't really want to delay to get to these questions, and it seems like that was a very fast response. So last one until the lights come on. What do you think, boy or girl? What do you think?
I'm going to be careful
I know,
there.
I'm just kidding. Phenomenal. Well, whenever we're ready, we can go to it, actually. Somewhere in the blackness out there are people with questions. There we go.
Great. You mentioned how to increase levels of aid, and obviously Ebola is something that's on many hearts and minds in this audience right now. And I read a report recently that basically said that incidents rather than epidemics are more likely to receive aid. In other words, 9/11 and the Haiti earthquake received incredible amounts of aid, whereas famine and other epidemics have a hard time pulling in the kind of numbers that they need to really address these issues. And therefore, aid becomes kind of reactive rather than preventive. I was wondering if you would agree with this as an issue, and how can we address this? Because Ebola is going to be a very hard problem to solve increasingly, and we can nip it in the bud as early as possible with the aid, but the aid's not going to come until it becomes an incident level. So what do we do with this dynamic, and how do we get the aid there that we need?
It's a good question. The basic problem is that we in the news media cover what happens today. We don't cover what happens every day. And the things that happen every day, by definition, aren't news. So, 17,000 kids died today before the age of 5 of mostly preventable diseases, malaria and diarrhea, this kind of thing. And because that's not news, those issues tend to get under-addressed. And while if there is an earthquake, then we're all over it. And I think that that's partly our responsibility, and that we need to figure out better ways of reminding the public about these perennial challenges, and that in turn drives drives money to them. But it's an uphill struggle, because again, if you're a television executive producer, then if you cover an earthquake, people will tune in. If you cover malaria, people will switch the channel. That's the challenge we face, and that's where, to some extent, the public and social media can perhaps address some of these things.
Thank you.
So you talked earlier about the difference between corporations being evil and nonprofits being, amazing. What do you think of things like B Corps and trying to push companies to at least have some sort of B Corp presence?
I think B Corps are a great idea. I mean, B Corps are this sort of hybrid in between companies and in between traditional for-profit companies and nonprofits. And I think that they are a really good idea. I must say that the market doesn't seem to embrace them very much, and investors seem suspicious of the idea of something that isn't completely profit maximizing. But I'm a believer, and Cheryl is, what she's doing now is basically trying to raise money for startups, especially those that have a mission, a double bottom line, triple bottom line companies, including B Corps.
Hi, I have so many questions for both of you, but I'm going to just do one. My name's Jessica. I work with an international organization called Thrive Networks, and what we do is we use M&A to create social good and scale social good. We've noticed kind of in our past year, as we've ramped this all up, there's really kind of negative connotations towards the word merger and towards the word acquisition in our beautiful nonprofit world. So my question for you is, let me find it. In your opinion, what can we do to lessen the stigma of merger so that we can encourage social entrepreneurs to consider more formal collaborations in this sector?
Yeah, maybe it is a question of framing. Maybe one has to talk about nonprofit marriages. That sounds kind of non-traditional marriage. I don't know. Because the M&A does sound very corporate, but I don't know whether uses a word like collaboration or marriage or something, but I do think that the idea is crucial, and there's so many organizations that, I remember going to Swarthmore once and meeting these social entrepreneurs and seeing these incredible organizations these students had started, doing amazing things all over the world and at home. And I was struck that they had all begun in about the last 2 or 3 years. And I said, well, if I had come 5 years ago, what would I have found? Would there have been nothing? And they said, oh no, there would have been, the professor said, oh, there would have been exactly the same, this profusion of amazing organizations. And then, they died out, basically. And so there's this incredible array of startups, and then they fade. So I do think that M&A, whatever one calls it, is one way of addressing that.
Thank you.
Hi. So a few years ago, my book club, and we read Half the Sky, and we were so moved by it that we started a giving circle that now has 50 members. So I want to say thank you for inspiring us. We've donated thousands to women's and girls' causes domestically and overseas, and we get together several times a year, and we hear from different groups.
Good for you.
We've given, thank you. We've given to education and maternal health. We had Sakina Yakubi from the Afghan Learning Network talk to us. We had Somali Mom talk to our group. So this year we have been focusing on sex trafficking and human trafficking, and I have to say, it's been the most, you talked about the joy of coming together and giving, but it's not joyous to learn about this topic. It seems so intractable, especially because there's so much money in sex trafficking and human trafficking that it seems something that's hard to get at. And one of the things that we've been trying to figure out is, do you focus on prevention? Do you focus on getting the girls out and giving them new lives? Do you focus on law enforcement? It's really hard, and if you had one of those 3 areas, prevention, kind of rescuing, or the law enforcement side, prevention being educating the girls, what would you think would be an area to focus on?
You know, I think trafficking is actually a fascinating issue because it addresses so many of these issues and ways to address them. It's so intimately wrapped up in poverty and the pathologies of poverty. And so many of the girls who end up getting trafficked, you know, their mom herself had been in some kind of very vulnerable position and then gave birth to her when she was 15, and then this girl was raised in a very vulnerable environment, didn't get a decent education, and then was preyed upon by a pimp, you know, when she turned 14 or 15, and was wrapped up in substance abuse, and so on. And so it does seem to me, you know, I sort of have this notion that we reach out, we have this deep human yearning for silver bullets, and really, there almost never is a silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot. And there are lots of ways one can make a difference.
Is that your phrase? That is amazing. That's great. Next book, maybe.
Silver buckshot?
I mean, I would, yeah.
Well, you know, I think the ways to address poverty broadly and trafficking in particular are kind of silver buckshot. You start with the fact that 30% of American teenagers get pregnant by the time they reach 19. And that's a failure of our ability to provide family planning to teenagers. And where there have been programs in St. Louis, in Colorado, to provide long-acting reversible contraceptives to at-risk teenage girls, then the pregnancy rate plunges. And when a 15-year-old girl gets pregnant and has a child, then that is disastrous for her. It usually ends her studying, her schooling, and for the child, who then becomes much more vulnerable to all the problems of poverty later on. So, you know, that is one proven starting point. Then you work with at-risk kids early on, and there is this sort of awkward thing to talk about, this parenting gap, and that, you know, children of professionals have heard 30 million more words by the age of 4 than a child on welfare. They begin to speak at the same time, but the child on professionals has been nurtured and spoken to constantly, is much better prepared for school, has a richer vocabulary. We can indeed address that, and there are programs like Nurse-Family Partnership that we talk we talk about Nurse-Family Partnership in the book, and it's you know, quite incredible. It ends at age 2, begins working with at-risk pregnant women in pregnancy, and then ends at age 2. At age 15, those kids are only half as likely to have been arrested because they got support early on in life. Then, you know, later on, we have this ridiculous system where the police go after the victims, these girls who've been trafficked, and arrest them, and don't go after the pimps and the Johns. And every year there's something like 100,000 girls who are trafficked into the sex trade in some form. That happens because there is a huge market for them, because there are guys who are buying them, and there essentially is no risk of buying sex with an underage girl. You're as likely to get arrested as you are to be hit by lightning. If that risk were just 5 or 10%, I think it would be enough to deter a lot of people. And you know, that's a function of police departments and prosecutors to begin to implement. In the Path of Peers, we talk about Nashville, Tennessee, which began a program involving a number of these elements, and you know, it doesn't work perfectly. Nothing does. But I think that one can make real progress against that issue, and that it's really, in many ways, kind of a question of political will. So more power to you for doing what you can.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention that in honor of your book, Half the Sky, we called it the One Sky Giving Circle. Thank you.
Oh, that's great.
Hi, Nick. So you're clearly a wonderful advocate and activist for so many important causes, and you deserve to be congratulated for that. But I do wonder if you haven't abdicated your role as a journalist somewhat. And the case of Somali Mom, who just came up in the previous question, is a good example. As you know, Somali Mom Foundation, which is headed up or Sheryl Sandberg is on the advisory board, investigated their own namesake and found that she was not what she claimed to be. You've made statements saying, we may never know the truth, I just don't know what to think. But have you tried to get to the bottom of what really happened there? Have you asked the Somali Mom Foundation for that report? And if not, why not?
So for those who don't know, so Somali Ma'am is a Cambodian woman who ran a organization, AFSEEP and Somali Ma'am Foundation, addressing trafficking in Cambodia. Early this year, Newsweek ran a cover story alleging that her backstory was essentially fabricated, and the Somali Ma'am Foundation here in the U.S. Severed itself from her and I think has now dissolved. Marie Claire has just run a piece that accuses Newsweek in turn of having committed all kinds of errors in its report about Somali Ma'am and suggesting that it was Newsweek that got it wrong. I've tried to report on this, and I don't know where the truth is. I don't have confidence in Somali's story now, her backstory, but I don't have confidence, I must say, in Newsweek's either.
What about the Somali Mom Foundation's report, though?
Yeah, I've talked to them repeatedly on and off the record. And I've spent a lot of time reporting this. I haven't been to Cambodia recently. Somali I thought did some amazing work in the field with those girls. On the other hand, I just don't know whether her backstory.
Will you try to get to the bottom of it, though?
Okay, we should keep moving on to the questions.
Yeah.
So we only have 5 more minutes, so thank you for the question. I'm going to remind folks to just dive right in so we can keep getting through a few more before we have to wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you both so much for your time. It's really an honor. I'll try to make this quick. So this is alluding to your question regarding social media and the paradigm of television coverage. As a reader, I feel constantly, in a good way, I think for the journalists that are doing it well, bombarded by a lot of crucial stories and relevant content. In today's world, we're so connected and we can share information so freely, it almost feels overwhelming to the point where a reader might feel as if there's so much happening and they can do so little because of the distance or the actual issue. Mr. Kristof, as a journalist, what is your advice to readers on how we can get involved, or what's your take on how journalists can help remedy this restlessness?
I think we can talk about cases where there has been an impact. And that's what we try to do in the book. I'm a believer in drops in the bucket. One of the stories we tell that I found particularly moving is that of Ollie Neal, who is this kid from this African-American boy in Arkansas who was very smart but sort of a troublemaker, and he got in trouble shoplifting. He was a loudmouth at school, reduced his teacher to tears, and then one day he's skipping class, and skipping English class, and he goes to the school library run by Mrs. Grady, and he sees this novel on the shelf by Frank Yerby, an African-American author. And it's got a cover of this woman in sort of a risque top. And it's risque by 1957 standards, so it's, presumably she's voluminously addressed by today's standards. And but this attracts his eye, and he thinks maybe he'd like to read it. But he's embarrassed at the idea of checking out a book, because he's a tough kid. So he steals it. And so he takes it home and reads it and really likes it. It turns him on to reading. And he returns it a week later, and he sees there's another Frank Yerby novel there. So he steals that too.
That he hadn't quite seen the week before, right?
He hadn't seen it before. Yeah. That's right. And then he returns it a week later and sees there's a third Frank Yerby book that he hadn't noticed before, and steals that. And this happens 4 times. And this really turns him on to reading. He begins to graduate to other novels, literary fiction, to current events. He goes to college, goes on to law school, becomes one of Arkansas's first African-American lawyers, becomes a leader in the civil rights movement, eventually a prosecutor, a judge. And so he's a hero of his high school reunions. And at one of these, he tells Mrs. Grady, it's your library that turned my life around, but I have to confess it's because I stole some of your books. And she says, well, I have a confession as well. I saw you steal that first book. And she said that she had been really angry. She'd been about to confront him. Why are you stealing a book when you can just check it out? And then she, in a flash of insight, had understood that he was a tough kid who was embarrassed to be seen checking out a book. So she let him steal it. Even though he had reduced her to tears earlier, in the hopes that he would like that book and want more, that weekend she drove 70 miles to Memphis to a used bookstore to look for another book by Frank Yerby. The first used bookstore didn't have one by him, so she went to another, and finally another, and for the third or fourth bookstore did. And so she bought that book, put it on the shelf, and she was thrilled when he stole the second book. And then this happened, then when he did that, she went back to Memphis and got another, and so on. And ultimately, it's kind of a reminder that helping people is harder than it looks. It doesn't always work out. But when one can take that risk, then sometimes it plays on dramatically in the lives of others, as Mrs. Grady did for Ollie Neal. And not everything is scalable. Not everything will solve a problem, but sometimes those drops in the bucket are completely transformative and are truly within our grasp.
So it is time for the last question. Thank you. It's time for our very last question, and it's a quick one. It's an informed tradition to ask everybody the following. Nick, what is your 60-second idea to change the world?
Early childhood interventions. I've only used 15 seconds, though.
I know. We could use them, though, so we could do that.
I think the evidence is overwhelming that the brain is developing particularly in the first 1,000 days after conception, and that if you miss that window, it's not that damage can't be undone, but that is when you have the most leverage, and that it's so much cheaper to help support a child early in life than it is to try to deal with a troubled 16-year-old years later. And yet, as a country, we're always picking the high-hanging fruit and never the low-hanging fruit, which is early childhood education.
Thank you. And before we wrap up, I just want to make a note. Nicole will be back on stage in a minute to give you directions for book signing and book purchases, so sit tight when we end. So to close here, Nick, thank you so much on behalf of all of us. I hope you know how many people you have touched and inspired over the years through your work on the ground and through your writing and advocacy. It's so powerful. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.